My name is Maddie Turner, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in the spring of last year, and not a day has gone by that I don't think about it. It started as a harmless idea, a camping trip to Kaymore Trail in West Virginia with my boyfriend Sam, my best friend Derek, and his girlfriend Tina. I wanted content for my YouTube channel where I explore eerie, offbeat places. This trip would change my life. We rolled into Fayetteville just after noon, our RV kicking up dust as we parked near the trailhead. Kaymore was a legend, an old mining town buried deep in the woods, abandoned for decades. The locals whispered about disappearances, ghost sightings, and curses, but I chalked it up to superstition. A good story, I thought, nothing more. Sam, 30 and the most grounded of us, frowned at the map. Trail looks rough. You sure we're ready for this? Of course, I said, adjusting the strap on my camera bag. It's a couple of miles in and we're only staying overnight. We'll be fine. Tina, 26, was already uneasy. I don't know, Maddie. I read that people hear things out there, like mining sounds, tools, voices. That's the point. Derek, 29, and my partner in crime for every harebrained adventure, grinned. We're here to find something creepy. He slung his bag over his shoulder and headed down the trail. The hike to the site was harder than I'd anticipated. The trail was steep, overgrown in places, and unmarked where landslides had swallowed parts of it. By the time we reached the remnants of Kaymore, the sun was low and a cool mist was rolling in. We set up camp near the ruins of an old mining structure, a skeleton of rusted metal and rotting wood. It didn't take long for things to go wrong. Sam cursed as he unpacked his tent. Poles are bent, this thing's useless. Use the tarp, I suggested, already fiddling with my camera. That's when I noticed the battery meter. Drained. I charged it before we left. Mine's doing it too, Tina said, holding up her flickering flashlight. Great, Derek muttered. Ghosts hate LED lights, huh? The first oddity came as we explored. Derek found an old miner's helmet lying on a collapsed beam. It was perfect for the video. I took out my phone to snap a picture, but by the time I turned back, the helmet was gone. You moved it, I said. I didn't touch it, Derek replied, the grin fading from his face. Later, as we sat by the fire, Tina froze. Did you hear that? Hear what? I asked. She pointed into the trees. Tapping, like metal on stone. We listened. At first, nothing. Then, faint and rhythmic, a metallic clang echoed from the direction of the mine shaft. It sounded like pickaxes, steady and deliberate. Probably the wind, I said. But Sam's expression said he wasn't convinced. The tapping grew louder as the night deepened. Derek, ever the skeptic, stood up and called into the woods, "Hey, ghost miners! We brought beer!" "Shut up, Derek," Tina hissed. Sam scanned the tree line with his flashlight. "It's not the wind," he said, his voice tight. "Something's out there." Shadows flickered between the trees, but whenever the light hit, there was nothing there. Just the whisper of leaves in the breeze. Then the footsteps started. Heavy, slow, deliberate, coming closer. We huddled by the fire. Tina clutched Derek's arm, and even he had gone pale. A figure emerged from the darkness. A man-shaped silhouette, blacker than the shadows around it, with hollow pits where its eyes should have been. "Back away," Sam whispered, gripping a branch from the fire as a makeshift weapon. The figure stopped just outside the firelight, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. It raised a hand, skeletal and clawed, and gestured toward the mine shaft. "Maddie," Tina whispered, "I think it wants us to go." "No way," Derek said. "We're staying right here." The figure stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. But the tapping continued. louder now, as though daring us to follow. Against better judgment, we ventured toward the mine at dawn. We couldn't leave without understanding what had happened, or so I told myself. The air grew colder as we approached, and the tapping grew louder. Inside the mine, the walls were slick with moisture, and the air smelled of rust and decay. We found the shrine in a cavern near the back. Candles had burned themselves out, their wax frozen in grotesque shapes. Symbols covered the walls, spiraling and chaotic. A rusted pickaxe leaned against a stone altar, and at its center sat a doll made of twigs and cloth. "It's a curse," Tina said, her voice trembling. "The miners disturbed something they shouldn't have, and now they're trapped here." "It's just old junk," I said, though my voice sounded hollow. I reached for the doll. "Maddie, don't!" Sam shouted, but it was too late. The moment my fingers brushed the fabric, the ground shook, and the mine roared with the sound of collapsing stone. The shadows came alive. Figures with hollow eyes emerged from every corner, their forms shifting like smoke but solid enough to trap us. Tina screamed as one reached for her, its clawed hand grazing her shoulder and leaving a welt. Derek swung his flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness but not the figures. "We need to leave something," Tina sobbed. "An offering. To the shrine." "It's not real," I shouted, but even I wasn't sure anymore. The spirits were closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on us. Derek threw his watch onto the altar. Take it and let us go." Nothing happened. The spirits advanced. "Maddie!" Sam shouted, his voice desperate. "Do it! Leave the camera!" I hesitated. This camera was my livelihood, my passion. But the figures were reaching for us, their claws outstretched. I set the camera on the altar, my hands shaking. Tina knelt, whispering a prayer. The figures froze. Slowly, they began to dissolve, their forms fading into the walls of the mine. The tapping stopped. The air grew still. We stumbled out of the mine, battered and shaken, but alive. No one spoke as we packed up the camp. The journey back to the RV was a blur, the trail almost unrecognizable in the daylight. The only sound was Tina's quiet sobbing. Back home, I tried to edit the footage from my phone. The files were corrupted, filled with static and shadows that shifted unnaturally. And when I unpacked my bag, I found my camera sitting inside perfectly intact. But when I turned it on, the only image it showed was the shrine, the twig doll staring back at me with hollow eyes. I haven't been back to Kaymore. I don't think I ever will. Some things are better left undisturbed. My name is Maggie Carter, and I was 28 when it happened. It was late October, crisp and cold, and I had planned the camping trip as a way to reconnect with my younger brother Ethan and shake off the stress of my job. We decided on Dolly Sod's Wilderness in West Virginia, a place famous for its stark beauty, rocky plateaus, and remote isolation. It sounded perfect, too perfect in hindsight. Ethan was 24, full of energy and always pushing boundaries, while I was the cautious one. This trip was supposed to be a chance to bridge the gap between us, especially after years of tension. My best friend Vanessa came along too. At 29, she was the kind of person who believed in crystals and spirits, which I always found a bit silly. But she was kind, and I thought she'd help balance Ethan's impulsiveness with her calming presence. We loaded up my RV early one Friday morning and drove to the trailhead. Ethan was already irritating me, of course. He'd forgotten decent hiking boots, so he had to wear his worn-out sneakers. I made a snide comment about him not taking things seriously, and he fired back with a sarcastic joke about me being the trip dictator. Vanessa stepped in to diffuse things, as usual, and we rolled into the parking area with an uneasy truce. The wilderness was stunning at first. Fog curled low over the rocky ground, and the stunted trees were stark against the pale sky. It felt like we'd stepped into another world. We planned to hike a loop trail over 3 days, camping 2 nights before returning to the RV. It was remote enough to guarantee no cell service, but not so far off the beaten path that I felt unsafe. That's what I thought anyway. We set up camp as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Everything was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. Vanessa noticed it first, commenting on how strange it was. Ethan shrugged it off, saying it was just a quiet forest. I told her not to worry, but the silence bothered me too. That night, the unease grew. I woke to a faint tapping on the RV's windows. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was a branch. Then I realized there were no trees close enough to touch the RV. I nudged Vanessa, who was asleep next to me, but the noise stopped as soon as I moved. I sat frozen in the dark, listening, until exhaustion finally pulled me back under. In the morning, Ethan claimed he'd seen someone in the woods while he was stoking the fire. Tall guy, weird-looking. He was just standing there staring at us, he said, grinning like it was a joke. I told him not to make things up to freak Vanessa out, but he insisted it was true. "Whatever," I said, brushing him off. Probably another hiker. The next day, I made the mistake of leading us off the main trail. I wanted to find a hidden vista I'd read about online, something with a great view of the valley below. The overgrown path I chose wasn't marked on any map, but I was confident we'd find our way back. We didn't. After about an hour, we stumbled into a clearing littered with bones. Deer, rabbits, maybe other animals I couldn't identify. They were arranged in a spiral pattern, bleached white and perfectly placed, like some twisted art installation. Ethan laughed nervously and joked about hillbilly voodoo, but Vanessa looked pale. "We shouldn't be here," she said, clutching the quartz necklace she always wore. I agreed for once. We turned back, but the feeling of wrongness stayed with us. By the time we reached camp, the sun was setting, and I was exhausted. My legs ached, and the tension between Ethan and me had worsened. He'd spent the entire afternoon mocking my decision to leave the main trail, calling me Captain Compass, and pointing out how lost we'd been. We ate in silence, the fire crackling in the growing dark. Vanessa stayed quiet too, staring out into the woods. "There's something out there," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something watching us." "Jesus, Vanessa," Ethan groaned. "Not this skinwalker crap again." She shot him a sharp look. "Don't say their name," she hissed. "Skinwalkers," Ethan said, grinning as he leaned closer to her. "Skinwalkers." I rolled my eyes and told them both to knock it off. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Vanessa was right. The forest seemed alive with shadows, shifting just beyond the firelight. I told myself it was my imagination, but then I heard it. My voice, calling from the woods. "Maggie?" It was faint but unmistakable. "Maggie, help me." My blood ran cold. I looked at Vanessa, who had gone rigid. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded. "It's not real," she said quickly. "Whatever you do, don't go out there." Ethan, of course, didn't listen. "Relax. It's probably just an echo or something." He grabbed his flashlight and started toward the tree line. "Ethan, stop!" I shouted, but he was already moving. He didn't get far. As soon as he stepped past the first row of trees, a figure emerged from the shadows. It looked human at first, tall and gaunt, with long limbs and pale skin. But as the light hit its face, I realized it wasn't human at all. Its features were stretched and distorted like a grotesque mask. Its eyes were hollow, empty pits. "Ethan," I whispered, but he was frozen, staring at the thing. The creature tilted its head, then opened its mouth. "Maggie," it said, in a warped, guttural voice that mimicked mine perfectly. Ethan stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The beam swung wildly, catching glimpses of claws and sharp, uneven teeth. The creature stepped forward, its joints bending unnaturally, and I grabbed Ethan, yanking him back toward the fire. We barricaded ourselves in the RV, locking the doors and pulling the curtains shut. The creature followed, circling the vehicle. Its clawed fingers scraped against the metal, slow and deliberate. It whispered our names, mimicking each of us in turn. Vanessa was shaking, clutching her necklace and muttering what sounded like a prayer. "It's a skinwalker," she said, her voice trembling. "It's trying to lure us out." "What do we do?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Salt," she said suddenly. "Do we have salt?" I scrambled through the cabinets until I found a shaker. Vanessa grabbed it and began sprinkling it around the doors and windows, chanting softly. The scratching stopped, but the whispers grew louder, more desperate. Ethan, pale and shaking, stared at the door. "It's not gonna leave, is it?" "No," Vanessa said grimly. "Not unless we drive." The RV wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again, but the engine only sputtered. Outside, the creature howled, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. We stayed locked in the RV all night, listening to the creature pacing outside. At one point, it stopped whispering and began banging on the walls, hard enough to make the vehicle shake. Vanessa kept chanting, clutching her necklace like a lifeline. At dawn, the noises stopped. The forest was silent again, eerily so. When I tried the engine, it roared to life like nothing had happened. We didn't waste any time. I threw the RV into gear and we sped down the dirt road, not looking back. As we reached the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature was standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. Its hollow eyes seemed to follow us, even as we drove away. Ethan hasn't spoken about that night since it happened. Vanessa refuses to go camping ever again. As for me, I can't forget the way it mimicked my voice. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear it again, soft and distant, calling my name. "Maggie, Maggie, help me." I'll never go back to Dolly Sods, and if you're smart, neither will you. My name is Logan Marsh, and I'm 38 years old. This happened last fall when I decided to take my first solo RV trip to Spruce Knob Lake in West Virginia. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to escape the wreckage of my divorce and prove to myself that I could handle life on my own. I was tired of feeling like a failure, and this trip was my attempt at reclaiming some confidence. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. The forest doesn't care about your pride. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, thanks to winding mountain roads and a temperamental GPS that insisted I make turns onto non-existent paths. Spruce Knob Lake lay in a valley surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Before heading to the lake, I stopped at a small gas station on the edge of town to fill up and grab a few snacks. The attendant was an old woman with gray hair pinned in a tight bun. Her eyes had the kind of intensity that made you feel exposed. "Heading to Spruce Knob, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Couple of days by the lake, should be peaceful." Her expression darkened. "Don't go wandering the woods after dark. And if you see a lantern, you turn the other way." "A lantern?" She leaned closer. "The devil's lantern. It'll lead you off the trail. Folks who follow it don't come back." I chuckled nervously, hoping to break the tension. "I'll keep that in mind." But as I drove away, her words lingered in my mind. By the time I reached the campground, the sun was dipping below the tree line. I parked the RV near the edge of the lake and set up a basic campsite. My gear was minimal: a rented stove, a second-hand flashlight, and a cheap folding chair that creaked every time I shifted my weight. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. The rustle of leaves, the soft lap of water against the shore, the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. Around 9 p.m., as I was reading by the dim glow of my lantern, I noticed something strange: a flickering light in the woods across the lake. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight or the glow of a campfire. It moved erratically, like an old oil lantern swaying in someone's hand. At first, I thought it might be another camper, but the more I watched, the more unsettling it became. The light moved deeper into the trees, then stopped. Then it blinked out. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I decided to explore one of the trails that looped around the lake. The air was crisp, the leaves a vibrant mix of red and gold, and for a while, I felt like I'd made the right choice coming here. About an hour into my hike, I heard it. Soft, rhythmic giggling. A child's laughter coming from somewhere ahead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. No response. As I rounded a bend, I saw her, a little girl sitting on a rock by the trail. She looked about 10 years old, with dark hair and a pale face. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a long skirt and a cardigan that seemed out of place. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on something in the distance. "Are you lost?" I tried again. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me out of the corner of her eye. Then she stood and walked into the forest without a word. "Wait!" I called, hurrying after her. But when I reached the spot where she'd disappeared, there was no sign of her. Just a muddy child's shoe sitting on the ground. By the time I got back to the RV, the clouds had rolled in, turning the afternoon gray and heavy. I tried to push the encounter with the girl out of my mind, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe she was a local kid playing in the woods. That night, things got worse. The electrical system in the RV started acting up. The lights flickered erratically and the radio turned on by itself, blasting static. My flashlight died even though I'd just put in fresh batteries. I lit my lantern for some semblance of control, but the flame cast dancing shadows on the walls that made the RV feel smaller, claustrophobic. Then came the sound of footsteps. They circled the RV, slow and deliberate. I peered out the window but saw nothing. Still, the sound continued, crunching leaves and snapping twigs just outside. I locked the door and sat on the bed, gripping a kitchen knife I'd brought for cooking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then a voice broke the stillness. "Logan." It was a child's voice. Against every instinct, I opened the door. The forest beyond was shrouded in darkness, but there it was again. The flickering light. The lantern. It hovered at the edge of the woods, swaying gently as if beckoning me closer. And then I saw her. The little girl, standing beneath the light. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying through the still air. I stepped out of the RV, my legs moving almost against my will. The lantern retreated into the forest and I followed, the girl's figure always just out of reach. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, the ground soft and uneven beneath my boots. The lantern led me to the edge of a ravine, its rocky walls plunging into darkness. At the bottom, I saw something glinting. A small mirror, cracked and streaked with dirt. The little girl stood beside it, her pale face illuminated by the lantern's eerie glow. "Jump," she said softly, her expression blank. What? I stammered, my voice trembling. You have to jump, she repeated. Her voice wasn't pleading anymore, it was cold, commanding. I looked down at the ravine, at the jagged rocks below. The lantern hovered above the abyss, flickering like it was waiting for me to obey. Something in me snapped. No, I said, my voice firm. The girl's face twisted into something monstrous, her eyes darkening and her mouth stretching into an unnatural grin. You don't get to choose, she hissed, her voice no longer human. I reached into my bag and pulled out my journal, the one thing I'd brought to document my journey, to rediscover myself. Without hesitation, I hurled it into the ravine. The lantern flared violently, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The girl screamed, a sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night, and then she and the lantern vanished. I stumbled back to the RV, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The electrical system was working again, the lights steady and the radio silent. I packed up and left before the sun rose, driving until I was miles away from Spruce Knob Lake. A week later, I found something waiting for me in my apartment. Sitting on the kitchen counter was an old oil lantern, its glass cracked and filled with ash. When I picked it up, I heard it, soft, rhythmic giggling, echoing from somewhere deep inside. I haven't camped since. The wilderness isn't always what it seems. Sometimes, it's better to stay lost in the chaos of the city than risk finding what waits in the silence of the woods. My name is Claire Jensen, and I'm 34 years old. This happened just last autumn, when the leaves in Dolly Sod's wilderness were fiery red and the air had the first chill of winter. I'd driven my RV into the Monongahela National Forest for a week of solitude and inspiration. As a freelance travel writer, I'd made a career out of escaping the noise of the city. But this time, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I was there to write about the beauty of isolation, about finding yourself in the wild. What I found instead was something I still struggle to explain, something that won't leave me alone, even now. The Dolly Sod's trailhead was quiet when I arrived, the parking lot nearly empty except for an old pickup truck and a battered camper. I parked my RV, loaded my gear, and set out to scout the area. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, but the stillness was uncanny. There weren't any birds singing, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. Just the crunch of my boots and the soft hum of the breeze. As I checked my map, an older man emerged from the trail. He was gruff-looking, with a weathered face and a hiking stick worn smooth by years of use. His name, I learned, was Bill. He gave me a long, assessing look before speaking. Dolly Sods can be tricky, he said, his voice gravelly. Stay on the marked trails. Don't wander off. And don't let the quiet fool you. It's not always empty out there. I laughed nervously. Thanks for the advice, but I've done this a lot. I'll be fine. He didn't laugh. The forest knows when you're alone, he said, then walked away without another word. I hiked out a few miles and found the perfect spot to set up camp. My RV was parked at the edge of the lot for the night, so this was just a scouting trip. The clearing I chose was beautiful, framed by skeletal trees with red leaves fluttering like whispers. I pitched my tent, pulled out my notebook, and started jotting down ideas for my article. That's when I saw her, a girl, maybe 16, sitting on a rock near the creek. She was dressed oddly, in a long skirt and a faded cardigan, her dark hair falling over her face. She didn't look up when I called out. "Hey," I said, walking closer. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I took a cautious step toward her, but before I could get too close, she stood and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I called after her, but it was like she hadn't heard me. That should have been my first clue to leave. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was setting. I planned to hike out farther the next day, deeper into the wilderness, but something felt off. My GPS wasn't working. It kept flickering and losing signal. The RV's battery, which I'd charged fully before leaving, was suddenly low, and the overhead lights flickered like they were protesting. I convinced myself it was just bad luck. Gremlins in the system, I muttered, trying to brush off the creeping unease. The night was unnervingly quiet. I read for a while, but my focus kept drifting back to the forest, to Bill's warning. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to a sound. A low, resonant hum, like the wind was playing a deep, hollow tune through the trees. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and searched every corner, but there was nothing there. No wind, no animals. Just me. But when I turned back to my bed, I froze. On the pillow was a twig, about 4 inches long, perfectly straight and smooth. It hadn't been there before. My door had been locked. The next morning, I tried to shake it off as a bad dream. I packed my day bag and set out to explore the area, following one of the marked trails. The crisp air and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots were calming, at least for a while. But as I hiked, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. The trail seemed to loop back on itself in ways that defied the map. Landmarks I'd passed earlier, like a fallen tree or a cluster of boulders, reappeared in places they shouldn't have been. Around midday, I found a spiral of stones on the ground, so precise it could have been carved. Nearby, another spiral made of twigs. I knelt to take a photo, but the lens on my camera fogged up despite the dry air. Just nature being weird, I whispered to myself. But I didn't believe it. The mimicry started that afternoon. I heard my name, clear as day from somewhere ahead. "Claire, help!" I froze. It was my voice, and it sounded terrified. I scanned the forest but saw no one. My rational mind told me it was an echo, some trick of acoustics, but I couldn't shake the dread that someone, or something, was watching me. I turned back toward camp, quickening my pace. The forest seemed darker now, the trees leaning in closer. I felt the weight of the silence pressing against my ears. Then I heard it again, closer this time. "Claire!" In my panic, I tripped over a root and slid down a steep embankment into a ravine. At the bottom, I landed hard on my side, wincing at the sharp pain in my ribs. My flashlight had gone out, but enough daylight filtered through the trees to see where I was. The ravine was filled with more spirals, some made of bones. At the center was an old mirror, its frame blackened as if burned. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and grinning in a way that I wasn't. "Leave," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Leave me alone." The grin in the mirror widened. My reflection raised a hand and pointed behind me. I turned slowly, and there it was. A shadowy figure, tall and angular, with hollow pits for eyes. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. The air around it seemed to bend, pulling me closer. I scrambled backward, hitting the mirror. The reflection still wasn't mine. It was laughing, silently, mockingly. The figure took a step forward, then another. My chest felt like it was being crushed. "You're not real," I said, though I didn't believe it. I grabbed a stone and hurled it at the mirror. The mirror shattered, and the figure vanished. But the spirals remained, and the oppressive silence pressed in harder than ever. I climbed out of the ravine, scraping my hands and knees on the rocks, and ran as fast as I could toward the RV. When I finally reached it, the battery was dead. The lights wouldn't turn on, the engine wouldn't start. I locked the door and sat in the driver's seat, clutching my knees, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, everything seemed normal. The RV started on the first try. My GPS worked again. I drove away without looking back, the forest retreating in my rearview mirror. But that night, when I went to unpack my bag, I found something I couldn't explain. My notebook was gone, replaced by a single page from it. Written in my handwriting, it read, "You were never alone." I haven't gone camping since. The wilderness still calls to me sometimes, but now I know it's not the solitude I seek, it's something else entirely. My name is Jake Ralston. I'm 40 years old, and for most of my life I thought I was tough enough to face anything. As a firefighter, I'd run into burning buildings without hesitation, confident I could control the chaos. That was before the accident, before a collapsing beam trapped me, and I had to watch a child die in the flames. I walked away physically unscathed, but the guilt, that stayed with me. Now, I live off-grid in my RV, drifting from one remote spot to another, trying to outrun memories that won't let me sleep. That's how I ended up at Seneca Rocks in West Virginia, chasing a rumor about a place called Devil's Hollow. The bartender at a rundown pub had mentioned it after a few beers, describing it as the kind of place that eats your soul. It sounded melodramatic, but the idea hooked me. Maybe the isolation would help. Maybe confronting something darker than my own mind would finally give me peace. I drove into the woods early on a foggy morning, the narrow road twisting like a serpent through dense trees. My RV bounced over potholes, the forest pressing closer with every mile. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. It felt like the kind of place the world forgot. Eventually, the road dead-ended in a clearing. I parked, stepped outside, and stretched, scanning the area. A rough trail led deeper into the woods, marked by a weathered sign that read, "Devil's Hollow, keep out." Perfect. The kind of ominous warning I'd come to expect from overblown local legends. I grabbed my backpack, packed with a flashlight, a knife, and some snacks, and set off down the trail. The forest grew denser with every step. The trees gnarled and twisted as if they were trying to block my way. The wind didn't reach this far in. It was silent except for the crunch of my boots on the leaf-strewn path. By mid-afternoon, I reached an old campsite. A fire pit, long cold, sat surrounded by rusted cans and scraps of cloth. There was a torn hiking boot lying in the dirt, its laces frayed. Nearby, I found a tattered map folded against a rock. I picked it up, curious. Scrawled in the margin were 3 words: "Don't follow them." I frowned, glancing around. "Follow who?" I muttered. Shoving the map into my pocket, I moved on, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees leaned closer, their bark cracked and blackened. Strange carvings appeared. Faces twisted in agony, their mouths open as if screaming. By the time I set up camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the woods shrouded in twilight. I built a small fire and sat beside it, staring into the flames. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of crying, a woman's voice, soft and broken, coming from the trees. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. "Hello?" I called, my voice rough in the still air. The crying stopped. I stood, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but endless trees. "Anyone out there?" I called again, louder this time. Nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. I told myself it was probably an animal, some nocturnal bird or a trick of the wind. Still, I kept the knife close as I lay down for the night. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my flashlight and knife, crawling out of the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light over the campsite. That's when I saw her. A young woman stood at the edge of the clearing, barefoot and dirty, her long hair tangled with leaves. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't go deeper." "Who are you?" I asked, my throat dry. "What are you doing out here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her figure swallowed by the darkness. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to follow. But something about her felt off, like she didn't belong here any more than I did. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Against my better judgment, I packed up camp and followed her trail. The carvings on the trees grew more frequent and grotesque, the air heavier with each step. I felt like I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't turn back. Not yet. That's when I found it. A natural rock arch rising out of the forest floor, its surface covered in ancient-looking symbols. Beneath it lay a shallow pit filled with ash and bones. Human bones. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The ground felt wrong here, the air thick with something I couldn't name. As I stood there, the shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into a figure. It was massive, its body cloaked in darkness, its eyes burning red. The apparition didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and searing, as if it were peeling back my skin to look inside me. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. I ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees twisting into impossible shapes. The path I'd followed was gone, replaced by jagged rocks and thick underbrush. The creature's voice followed me, low and mocking, whispering my failures, my guilt, my pain. "You let her die," it hissed, the words striking like a whip. "You watched her burn?" I tripped, falling hard onto the ground. When I looked up, the woman was there again, Diana, or whatever she was. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, her eyes hollow. "Help me," she begged, reaching out a hand. I hesitated. The creature's voice filled my head again. "You can't save her. You couldn't save anyone." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stand. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking. "You're just in my head." The apparition laughed, a terrible sound that echoed through the hollow. "Everything here is real, Jake, including your sins." I turned and ran again, ignoring the whispers, the shadows, the faces that seemed to form in the trees. When I finally stumbled back to my RV, I was bleeding and covered in scratches, but alive. The air felt lighter as I slammed the door shut and locked it. I drove out of those woods without looking back. Whatever had been in the hollow, ghost, demon, or something worse, it hadn't killed me, but it had left its mark. I still hear its voice sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, reminding me of what I've lost. I'll never go back to Devil's Hollow, and if you're smart, neither will you. My name is Sarah Hayes. I was 35 years old when I went to Hawks Nest State Park in West Virginia to write a feature story about ghostly legends in Appalachia. I didn't believe in ghosts or curses or restless spirits then. I thought they were just tales, stories people told to make life a little more exciting. I was wrong. It was late fall, and the park was nearly empty, which suited me just fine. I'd recently gone through a divorce and needed both a distraction and a paycheck. My editor at the magazine had loved the idea of me spending 3 nights alone in one of the most haunted places in the state, with nothing but my RV and my laptop. The idea was to blend travel and horror, something edgy for Halloween season. At the time, I thought it was just another gig. Looking back, I should have listened to the warnings. The drive into Hawk's Nest was beautiful. Rolling hills, winding roads, and mist hanging low over the New River Gorge. It felt otherworldly, like stepping back in time. I arrived at the visitor center just after noon, planning to check out a few trails before setting up camp. The park ranger at the desk was a wiry man in his 60s, with a lined face and wary eyes. "Camping alone?" he asked, as I filled out the paperwork. "Yep," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Doing a piece on haunted parks." He frowned. "Well, just stick to the main trails and stay away from the old mining areas. Folks around here say they're not welcoming." "Welcoming?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean haunted?" His face hardened. "I mean dangerous. Ground's unstable, and it's easy to get turned around. Some things are better left alone." I nodded politely, but I didn't take him seriously. I'd hiked all over the country and knew how to handle myself. Besides, if there was something eerie about the park, I wanted to see it. I parked my RV at a remote overlook, a spot where I could see the river far below and the endless stretch of forest. The view was breathtaking. I spent the evening taking notes, snapping photos, and soaking in the silence. That night, I woke to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard it again, a faint humming, like someone softly singing. I froze, listening. It was coming from the woods, a woman's voice, the melody strange and haunting. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the wind or my imagination. I tried to go back to sleep, but the humming stayed with me, echoing in my mind. The next morning, I set out on a trail that led deeper into the forest. It was supposed to loop back to the campground, but I noticed an unmarked path branching off into the trees. It wasn't on my map, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow it. The path led to what looked like the remains of an old mining operation. There were rusted tools scattered in the dirt, collapsed tunnels, and a small cemetery with crooked wooden crosses. The air felt heavier here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. In the center of the clearing, I found something strange. A spiral made of rocks and bones. The bones were small, birds, maybe, and arranged so perfectly it couldn't have been natural. I took a picture, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. As I stood there, I thought I heard a whisper, faint and indistinct, like the forest was trying to speak. I spun around, but there was no one there. That evening, the humming came back. It started softly, almost too faint to hear, but it grew louder as the night deepened. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the woods. There, just beyond the edge of the trees, was a figure. A woman, dressed in a long, tattered dress, her face pale and blurred by the mist. She stood perfectly still, staring at me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you lost?" She didn't move. For a moment, I thought she might be a mannequin or a trick of the light, but then she raised her hand, pointing deeper into the forest. Before I could react, she vanished. I stumbled back into the RV, locking the doors and drawing the curtains. My rational mind told me it had to be a trick, a reflection, or my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman had been trying to tell me something. I decided to do some research, pulling out an old guidebook I'd brought with me. That's when I found it. A brief mention of the Hawk's Nest tunnel disaster. In the 1930s, hundreds of men had died while digging tunnels for a hydroelectric project. They'd been exposed to silica dust without protection, and many of them succumbed to acute silicosis. The book said the bodies of black and immigrant workers were often buried in unmarked graves to avoid scandal. It was horrifying. And it explained the cemetery, the bones, the heavy, suffocating air of the place. These men had been forgotten, their lives erased by greed. That night, as I sat in the RV, I felt the air grow cold. The humming began again, louder this time, and then the whispers came. They were all around me, soft and desperate, calling my name. Sarah? I turned to the window and saw them, figures in the mist. Shadowy, hunched shapes, their faces obscured, their breaths wheezing and labored. They didn't move, just stared, their hollow eyes full of pain and anger. The RV began to shake. At first, it was a faint tremor, but it grew more violent, as if something was pounding on the walls. I grabbed my camera and phone, hoping to record what was happening, but neither would turn on. The lights flickered, and the whispers became a roar. Then I saw her, the woman from the woods. She was standing inside the RV now, her face clearer than before. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, with wide, pleading eyes. "Help them," she whispered, her voice like wind through leaves. "Tell their story." She pointed to the table where my laptop sat, and then she was gone. I didn't hesitate. I opened the laptop and began typing. I wrote everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned about the miners and their tragic fate. The words poured out of me, like they were being pulled from somewhere deep inside. As I finished, the RV went silent. The figures outside were gone, and the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The next morning, I drove out of Hawk's Nest as fast as I could. When I got back to civilization, I posted the story online. It went viral almost immediately. People were horrified by what had happened and demanded action. Within weeks, a small monument was erected in the park to honor the miners who had been lost. But even now, I can't forget the woman in the woods or the whispers in the night. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear them again, and I wonder if I've truly told the whole story, or if there's more waiting for me back in those haunted hills. My name is Caleb Reynolds. I'm 34 years old, and I live a life most people would call lonely. It wasn't always like this. 2 years ago, I had a fiancé, a stable job, and a future mapped out. But that all changed when June died in a car accident. A crash I survived, but couldn't stop blaming myself for. Since then, I've traded my apartment for a converted RV, wandering wherever the road takes me. It's cheaper than therapy and quieter than grief. This happened last October. I was in Randolph County, West Virginia, chasing isolation to finish a novel I'd been working on. The story wasn't coming together, and the pressure was mounting. I told myself that heading into the woods would clear my mind. What I found instead was something far darker. The drive to the abandoned campground took me deeper into the backwoods than I'd ever been. The gravel road was rough, barely visible under years of overgrowth. My GPS had long since lost signal, but I trusted the old printout map I'd found online. The place was listed as Big Run Hollow Campground, a long-defunct RV park that promised quiet, solitude, and nothing else. My RV rattled over rocks and roots as I pulled into the clearing. The campground was in ruins, as expected. Rusted RVs, their windows shattered, sat in a strange circular pattern around a massive stone fire pit in the center. Moss and ivy crept up their sides, and personal belongings, shoes, toys, even faded family photos, lay scattered around, eerily undisturbed. I parked near the edge of the circle and stepped out, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot breaking the heavy silence. No birds, no wind. Just an unnatural stillness that wrapped around me like a weighted blanket. This is perfect, I muttered to myself, though I didn't fully believe it. The first day passed uneventfully. I explored the area, careful not to stray too far from the campground. Something about the place made me uneasy. The strange way the RVs were positioned, as if they were part of some forgotten ritual. I kept my distance from the fire pit, though I couldn't say why. That night, I cooked dinner on a portable stove and sat outside, notebook in hand. The words didn't come easily, but I tried to push through. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched long and thin, creeping toward the center of the circle. Then I heard it. Laughter. Faint, childlike, and far too close. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, soft and fleeting, as if carried on a non-existent breeze. It was coming from the fire pit. "Hello," I called, my voice swallowed by the silence. No response. Just that oppressive stillness. I told myself it was my imagination and went back inside the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of June. In the dream, she was alive, sitting across from me at a cafe we used to frequent. Her smile was as radiant as ever, but there was something off about her eyes, too bright, too knowing. She reached across the table, her touch cold against my hand. "You shouldn't stay there, Caleb," she said, her voice layered with an echo, as if two people were speaking at once. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The clock read 3:12 a.m. Outside, the campground was pitch black, but I swore I saw a figure standing near the fire pit. A shadowy outline, motionless and watching. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window. Nothing. Just the empty clearing. The next morning, I tried to shake off the dream and the unease it brought. I told myself it was just grief messing with my head, an old wound reopened by the isolation. Still, I couldn't ignore the oddities around the campground. The footprints in the dirt, for example, large and human-like but with clawed toes. They weren't mine, and they circled my RV. Determined to distract myself, I explored the gutted RVs. Inside one, I found an old family photo pinned to the wall. A man, a woman, and two children, all smiling. The edges of the photo were burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it but stopped halfway. Beneath it, carved into the wall, was a spiral symbol with claw-like extensions. I saw the same symbol etched onto trees and other RVs as I wandered the campground. It felt deliberate, like a warning, or a trap. That evening, as I cooked dinner, the laughter returned. This time, it was louder and closer. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the clearing was empty. Then came the whispers. "Caleb!" The voice was faint but unmistakable. June's voice. I dropped the flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. "June?" I called, hating the desperation in my voice. The whisper came again, from the direction of the fire pit. Against my better judgment, I approached, the beam of my flashlight trembling. At the edge of the pit, I found a scrap of fabric fluttering in the non-existent breeze, a piece of June's favorite scarf. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, clutching the fabric like a lifeline. But the feeling of being watched was unbearable. That night, the dreams were worse. June appeared again, this time standing at the edge of the fire pit, beckoning me with a smile that was all wrong. "Light it, Caleb," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Set me free." I woke to the sound of scratching at my RV door. My breath hitched as I grabbed the nearest weapon, a crowbar I kept under the bed. The scratching stopped, replaced by soft, uneven footsteps circling the RV. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, I saw her. Or what looked like her. June's face, pale and lifeless, stared back at me from the darkness. Her eyes were black pits, her mouth stretched into a too-wide grin. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice distorted and echoing. I slammed the blinds shut and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I considered leaving, but my RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, as if the vehicle itself were refusing to let me go. With no choice but to stay, I spent the day piecing together the fragments of the campground's history. The locals called it the Hollow Campground, though it wasn't marked on any official maps. According to old records, several families had gone missing here in the early 1980s. The only consistent detail in the reports was a legend tied to the area, a witch who had been lynched in the 1800s for allegedly luring children into the woods. They said her curse lingered, preying on the lonely and the grieving. By the time night fell, I knew I wasn't alone. The laughter came again, but this time it was joined by whispers and footsteps, closing in from all sides. I barricaded myself inside the RV, clutching the crowbar as the shadows outside grew darker and denser. The air felt thick, electric, as if the campground itself was alive. And then I heard June's voice. "Caleb, please," she pleaded, her tone soft and broken. "Help me. Light the fire." I looked out the window. She was standing by the fire pit, her body half shrouded in shadows. For a moment, I believed it was really her, that I could save her. But then I saw the spiral symbol glowing faintly in the dirt around her feet. The same symbol carved into the RVs. It was a trap. Desperate to end whatever was happening, I grabbed the old iron rod I'd found earlier and stepped outside. The air was freezing, and every breath felt like it carried a weight. As I approached the fire pit, the shadows around June writhed, forming grotesque shapes with elongated limbs and empty eyes. "You're not her," I said, my voice trembling. "You're not June." The figure tilted its head, the grin widening. "But you want me to be." It lunged. I swung the iron rod, the contact sending a shockwave through my body. The creature shrieked, its form flickering like a dying flame. The shadows recoiled, and for a moment the campground was still. But I knew it wasn't over. Using the rod, I destroyed the fire pit, scattering the stones and breaking the circle. The air seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. As I turned to leave, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. It didn't follow. By morning, my RV started without issue. I drove away without looking back, my hands shaking on the wheel. I never finished the novel, and I haven't gone camping since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear June's voice in my dreams. "Caleb, come back." And I know the Hollow Campground is still waiting. My name is Evelyn Parker, and I'm 42 years old. I used to think of myself as strong. I spent 20 years in the ER, facing death and chaos every day without flinching. But grief? That's a whole different battlefield. When my husband, Mark, passed away suddenly last year, I realized how fragile I really was. That's how I ended up here, traveling alone in my RV, trying to outrun a sorrow that feels like it's chasing me. This happened in late October. I'd been on the road for weeks, crisscrossing West Virginia, when I decided to stop at Cooper's Rock State Forest. The park was beautiful, even in the off-season. Cliffs overlooking the Cheat River Gorge, endless pines stretching into the horizon. I thought the solitude would help me clear my head, maybe even spark some peace. But it was the singing pines that caught my attention. I first heard about the grove at the visitor center. A ranger, an older man with a weathered face, handed me a map. "Stick to the main trails," he said. "Don't go wandering toward the singing pines." "Why not?" I asked, curious. He hesitated. "It's just bad luck is all. Folks hear things they shouldn't. Some don't come back. That should have been my first warning, but I'd never been one to shy away from a challenge. The campground was practically deserted when I arrived, which suited me fine. I parked my RV at a site near the edge of the forest, the closest I could get to the trails. It was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove and settled in with a book. The cold crept in faster than I expected, but my RV's heater held up. I went to bed early, hoping to wake refreshed for a hike the next day, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint noises outside, whispers almost, though I told myself it was just the wind. At some point, I must have drifted off because I dreamed of Mark. In the dream, he stood among the trees, wearing the same flannel shirt he'd had on the day we met. His smile was warm, familiar. "Evelyn," he said, reaching out to me. "You found me." I woke up with tears on my cheeks. The clock read 3:47 a.m. The RV felt colder than it should, the heater struggling against the chill. Outside, the night was impossibly dark. The next morning, I decided to hike toward the Singing Pines. Ranger's warning be damned. The trail was rugged but manageable, winding through a dense forest of towering evergreens. The air was crisp, and for the first time in months I felt a flicker of something like hope. The grove wasn't marked on the map, but it wasn't hard to find. As I drew closer, the trees grew taller and thicker, their branches arching overhead like a cathedral. That's when I heard it. The hum. It was faint at first, a low melodic vibration carried on the wind. It didn't sound like birds or insects. It was almost human, like a choir singing in perfect harmony. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, but it made my skin crawl. I pushed on, curiosity overriding caution. The hum grew louder, more distinct, until I stepped into a small clearing. The grove. The pines stood in a perfect circle, their trunks unnaturally straight. At the center was a large moss-covered stone. The hum stopped the moment I entered. The sudden silence was deafening. I stood frozen, unsure what to do next. That's when I saw the carvings. The bark of each tree was etched with symbols, spirals, runes, and crude shapes that looked almost human. They didn't seem random, they felt deliberate, like a warning. I told myself I was being silly and turned back toward the trail, but as I walked away I felt it, a presence. Something was watching me. That night, the hum returned. It wasn't outside this time. It was inside my RV. Faint, almost imperceptible, but there. I tried to ignore it, wrapping myself in a blanket and focusing on the fire I'd built in the portable stove. But then the whispers started. "Evelyn!" I froze. The voice was soft, familiar, Mark's voice. "Evelyn, I'm here." My heart raced as I scanned the RV, but it was empty. The voice came again, this time from outside. "Come to me." I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The forest was pitch black, the trees silhouetted against the moonlight. I shone the beam of my flashlight toward the grove. That's when I saw him. Mark. Standing just inside the circle of pines, his face pale but smiling. He was beckoning to me. "Evelyn, don't be afraid." My legs moved before I could stop them. I stumbled toward the grove, the flashlight shaking in my hand. But as I crossed into the clearing, something shifted. Mark's face changed. The smile widened unnaturally, stretching ear to ear. His eyes darkened, becoming empty black pits. The hum grew louder, almost deafening. As the air around me turned icy, I froze, my body screaming at me to run. "You're not him," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, that grotesque smile never wavering. "But I could be," it said. Its voice layered with marks and something else, something ancient and cruel. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. My memory of that night is a blur of terror and adrenaline. When I finally locked the door behind me, I collapsed on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep. Instead, I researched. The visitor center had mentioned local legends, and I started piecing them together. The Grove had a dark history, tied to a young woman named Clara Abbott. In the 1800s, she'd been accused of witchcraft after several children went missing. The townsfolk had lynched her in the Grove, burying her body beneath the moss-covered stone. But the disappearances didn't stop. Instead, they grew worse. The stories said Clara's spirit haunted the Grove, luring the lonely and grieving with her song. She offered them peace, a reunion with lost loved ones, but at a cost. The next evening, I heard the hum again. This time, it didn't stop at the Grove. It surrounded the RV, seeping into my mind like a drug. I saw visions of Mark, his face, his smile, his laughter. I saw the life we could have had, the children we never got to raise. It was intoxicating, and I felt myself slipping. But then I remembered the symbols on the trees. They weren't just warnings. They were bindings, keeping Clara's spirit contained. I grabbed my journal, scribbling down a plan. If I destroyed the Grove, I could break her hold. It was a desperate idea, but I had no other choice. Armed with a can of lighter fluid and trembling hands, I ventured back to the Grove. The hum grew louder with every step, the air heavy and suffocating. Shadows danced between the trees, and Clara's voice filled my ears. "Evelyn, stay. He's waiting for you." When I reached the clearing, she was there, pale and ethereal, her hair flowing like smoke. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I almost believed her. "You can have him back," she said, her voice sweet and venomous. "Just light the fire." I hesitated, my grip on the lighter fluid faltering. But then I saw the truth in her eyes. Emptiness. Hunger. She didn't want to reunite me with Mark. She wanted to consume me. With a scream, I doused the Grove in lighter fluid and struck a match. The flames roared to life, engulfing the pines and the moss-covered stone. Clara shrieked, her form twisting and writhing as the fire consumed her. And then, silence. By morning, the Grove was nothing but ash. The hum was gone, and the forest felt lighter. But I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up the RV and drove away, the charred remains of the singing pines disappearing in my rearview mirror. Even now, I can still hear the faint echo of the hum in my dreams. But I survived. And for now, that's enough. My name is Katie Harper, and I'm 27 years old. I've always loved the outdoors, camping, hiking, being surrounded by the quiet beauty of nature. But what happened in the Monongahela National Forest last October changed the way I see the wilderness forever. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, a chance to reconnect with old friends and prove to myself that I could still find peace out there, even after everything I'd been through. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. It started as a casual idea during a group chat. Ryan Morales, my best friend from college, suggested we tackle an unmarked trail near Spruce Knob. Breathtaking views. Barely anyone around, he'd said. That was all Ryan needed to hear, an adventure far off the beaten path. Lila Barnes, the mediator of our trio, had been hesitant but relented. She was the sensitive type, a believer in energy and spirits, but she loved the idea of spending time with us. And me? I just wanted to prove I wasn't afraid anymore. The morning we arrived, the trailhead was everything Ryan had promised. isolated and overgrown, the kind of place most people wouldn't bother with. I double-checked my gear, a good sleeping bag, weatherproof tent, high-powered flashlight, and enough food to last us longer than we planned to stay. Ryan, of course, had packed light. Too light. "You brought that?" I said, eyeing his flimsy-looking sleeping bag. "It's fine, Katie," he replied with a grin. "I'm not planning to freeze to death." Lila rolled her eyes. "You're going to complain the whole time, aren't you?" We set off late morning, the sun filtering through the dense canopy of the forest. At first, everything felt normal. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. The trail was rough, but I'd expected that. What I didn't expect was how quickly the atmosphere would change. By mid-afternoon, we were deep in the woods, and the familiar sounds of nature started to fade. The birds stopped singing. The trees, once so vibrant, seemed darker, almost menacing. Even the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. Lila was the first to mention it. "Does it feel quieter to you guys?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Ryan laughed it off. "It's just the wind dying down. Don't psych yourself out." I wanted to believe him, but something about the silence wasn't natural. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As the day wore on, the trail became harder to follow. Signs of human passage disappeared, replaced by thick underbrush and moss-covered rocks. My map was useless. Ryan teased me about overthinking, but when we came across a weathered wooden sign with the words "Turn Back," barely legible beneath layers of grime, even he fell silent. "It's probably just a joke," he said after a moment. "Someone trying to scare off hikers." Lila shook her head. "Feels like a warning." Despite my growing unease, I didn't want to back out. I needed to finish this hike, to prove to myself that I could handle it. So we pressed on, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the forest grew colder and darker. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. Ryan got the fire going while Lila and I prepared our tents. As we settled in for the night, the usual camaraderie returned. We joked, ate, and shared stories around the fire. For a moment, it felt like old times until we heard the scream. It came from deep in the woods, a shrill, piercing cry that froze me in place. Lila's face went pale, and Ryan stood up, flashlight in hand. "Probably an animal," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "No animal makes a sound like that," Lila whispered. We listened, straining to hear anything over the crackling of the fire. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it, someone calling my name. "Katie." It was a soft, lilting voice, barely audible but unmistakable. My stomach churned. It sounded like my brother, Nate. He'd died when I was 16, lost in the woods during a family camping trip. I knew it couldn't be him, but the voice was so eerily familiar. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Ryan said, scanning the trees with his flashlight. "It said my name," I insisted. "It sounded like—" Before I could finish, Ryan's light flickered and died. "Damn thing's out of batteries," he muttered. We retreated to our tents after that, but sleep didn't come easily. The sounds outside, branches snapping, faint whispers, kept me awake. I gripped my flashlight tightly, my heart pounding with every noise. The next morning, we discovered something strange. Around our campsite were large footprints, almost human but with elongated toes and a strange, claw-like shape at the end. They circled the fire pit and disappeared into the woods. Ryan tried to laugh it off, calling it a prank, but Lila and I weren't so sure. As we packed up to leave, the forest felt even more hostile. shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, and the oppressive silence followed us. Then, around noon, we heard it again. Someone calling for help. "Ryan!" The voice was desperate, pleading. "That's me," Ryan said, stopping in his tracks. "No, it's not," Lila snapped. "You're right here. That's not you." The voice called out again, closer this time. Ryan, always the skeptic, marched toward the sound despite our protests. He disappeared into the trees, leaving Lila and me alone on the trail. Minutes passed, then an hour. When he finally returned, something about him was off. His skin was pale, his eyes distant. He spoke little, his usual confidence replaced by an eerie calm. Lila and I exchanged worried glances but didn't press him. Not yet. As night fell, the tension between us grew. Lila whispered to me that she'd seen Ryan standing outside her tent the night before, staring into the woods. "I don't think it's him," she said, her voice shaking. "I think it's something else." I wanted to dismiss her fear as paranoia, but when Ryan spoke, his voice sounded wrong. There was a guttural edge to it, something not quite human. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he possessed? Was I imagining things? The next day, everything unraveled. Ryan's behavior grew stranger. He refused to eat, instead watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. At one point, he muttered something under his breath. Words I couldn't understand, but sent a chill down my spine. Lila was the first to snap. "You're not Ryan," she said, backing away from him. "What are you?" He laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the trees. "You don't want to know." That was the moment I knew we had to leave. But Ryan, or whatever he'd become, wasn't going to let us go easily. As we packed, he stood between us and the trail, his grin stretching impossibly wide. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. "You can't leave," he said. "Not yet." When he lunged, I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the canister of fuel from my pack and hurled it at him, igniting it with my lighter. Flames roared to life, spreading quickly through the dry brush. Ryan, or the thing wearing his face, shrieked and stumbled backward, disappearing into the inferno. Lila and I ran. The fire spread behind us, consuming everything in its path. By the time we reached the trailhead, we were covered in soot and barely able to stand. Ryan was gone. We reported him missing, but no trace of him was ever found. Weeks later, I received a voicemail from his number. His voice, distorted and filled with static, whispered my name. "Katie, come back." I deleted it, but the memory lingers. The forest isn't just a place of beauty and solitude. It has its own rules, its own predators, and some things should never be found. My name is Gavin Reed, and I was 41 when I went to Coyote Hollow in West Virginia to capture the perfect shot. This happened in the early fall of 2021, when the air was crisp and the trees were a kaleidoscope of red and gold. I'm a nature photographer, the kind who spends weeks in the wild to find moments most people only see in magazines. Solitude doesn't scare me, it's where I thrive. But this time, the hollow didn't just challenge me, it almost claimed me. Coyote Hollow had a reputation. Locals warned of strange happenings, phantom gunshots, glowing eyes in the woods, and a cursed hunter who was said to stalk the hollow, luring people to their deaths. The Devil's Huntsman, they called him. I didn't believe any of it. Ghost stories are a dime a dozen in remote places like this. Besides, I wasn't here for legends. I was here for wildlife shots, specifically a rare species of owl that supposedly nested in the hollow. The drive-in was uneventful. though the narrow, winding trail to the hollow was almost too much for my RV. By the time I found a clearing big enough to park, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the dense forest. I stepped out, breathing in the cool air and marveling at how untouched this place was. It was perfect. That night, the first sign came. I was reviewing the day's photos when I heard it. A single gunshot echoing through the trees, sharp and distant. I froze, listening, but the forest quickly returned to its natural silence. A hunter, I figured. Nothing unusual. But then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by the faint blare of a hunting horn. I stepped outside with my flashlight, scanning the woods. "Hello?" I called out. The beam cut through the dark, but there was no sign of anyone. Just the wind stirring the leaves. When I returned to the RV, I found my camera on the floor, its lens cap off. I knew I'd left it on the table. A chill crept up my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe I'd bumped it earlier and forgotten. Solitude does strange things to the mind. The next morning, I hiked deeper into the hollow. The forest was dense, with beams of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I spotted deer tracks and a few birds, but no sign of the elusive owl. As I rounded a bend, I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. The tents were shredded, their fabric hanging like torn sails. A rusted camping stove lay on its side, and a camera was half buried in the dirt. Curious, I brushed off the grime and turned it on. To my surprise, it still had power, and the photos told a chilling story. Blurry shots of the forest, a shadowy figure in the distance, and finally, a close-up of something with glowing red eyes. I packed the camera in my bag, my mind racing. It was probably a prank, I told myself, or a bear, definitely a bear. That afternoon I met Caleb Atwood, a grizzled hunter who seemed to appear out of nowhere. I was photographing a cluster of mushrooms when his voice startled me. "Shouldn't be here," he said, stepping out of the trees with a rifle slung over his shoulder. I straightened, trying to hide my surprise. "I'm just passing through, looking for owls." Caleb gave a dry laugh. "Owls, huh? You're more likely to find trouble. This hollow ain't safe." "Because of the huntsman?" I asked, half smiling. Caleb's face darkened. "Laugh all you want, but he's real. I've seen him myself. Big as a man, but not a man. Eyes like fire. He don't like trespassers." "Come on," I said. "It's just a legend." He stepped closer, his voice low. "Legends come from somewhere. If you're smart, you'll leave before nightfall." With that, he disappeared back into the woods. I didn't leave. Instead, I spent the evening reviewing the photos from the abandoned camera. The shadowy figure and glowing eyes nagged at me, and I couldn't shake Caleb's warning. As the sun set, the hollow grew unnaturally quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then came the gunshot. This time it was close enough to make me jump. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. The light caught movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks, too fast to be human. My heart raced as I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. But the hollow wasn't done with me yet. The RV shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. I stumbled, falling against the table, and then I heard it. Hoofbeats, heavy and deliberate, circling the vehicle. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The hoofbeats stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I saw tracks. Enormous, cloven hoofprints leading away from the RV and into the woods. The next day, I found Caleb again. Or maybe he found me. He was waiting near the trailhead, chewing on a piece of jerky. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked, his tone grim. I nodded. "What is it? A demon? A ghost?" "Both," Caleb said. "He was a man once, a hunter who made a deal with the devil, traded his soul for skill, but when it came time to pay, he tried to cheat his way out. Now he's stuck here, hunting souls to replace his own." "Can it be stopped?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Caleb shrugged. "You don't stop him. You survive him. Offer him something he values more than you." That night, the huntsman came for me. The air grew thick, oppressive. The RV's lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Then I saw him, a towering figure at the edge of the clearing, his body shrouded in darkness. His head was that of a stag, with massive antlers and glowing red eyes that burned like embers. He raised a hunting horn to his lips, and the sound that followed was otherworldly, a deep, mournful wail that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my camera gear, desperate for some kind of plan. Caleb's words echoed in my mind. "Offer him something he values more than you." The only thing I had was a hunting knife, one I'd carried for years, a gift from my brother before his death in a hunting accident. Guilt had followed me ever since, and the knife was a constant reminder of the day I failed to stop him from taking the shot that cost him his life. I stepped outside, clutching the knife. The huntsman stood motionless, his burning eyes fixed on me. "This is what you want, isn't it?" I shouted, holding the knife high. "Take it." He lunged, closing the distance in an instant. I threw the knife at his feet and stumbled back, my heart hammering. The huntsman paused, tilting his head as if considering the offering. Then, slowly, he reached down, his long clawed fingers wrapping around the blade. For a moment, the hollow was deathly silent. Then the huntsman let out a roar that shook the ground and disappeared into the shadows, taking the knife with him. By dawn, the hollow was still again, as if nothing had happened. The hoof prints were gone, and the air felt lighter. I packed up and left without looking back. The weight of the past finally lifted from my shoulders. Weeks later, a package arrived at my door. Inside was one of my lost camera lenses, and a single photo of the huntsman standing over the knife. His burning eyes seemed to follow me, a reminder that the hollow wasn't done with me yet. Some places aren't meant to be conquered. Coyote Hollow is one of them. My name is Dana Harper. I was 34 when I spent 3 nights alone at Widow's Ridge in West Virginia, chasing a story I should have left alone. This happened in the fall of 2021, when the air carried the first chill of winter and the forests turned crimson and gold. I was a freelance writer, known for my series on haunted places in America, and my latest article was supposed to focus on Widow's Ridge, a secluded spot in Monongahela National Forest. Locals spoke of Eleanor Price, the widow of the Ridge, a woman accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. Her husband and children had vanished, and the townsfolk blamed her. Some claimed she killed them in a ritual. Others whispered darker things. She was hanged from a gnarled oak tree at the ridge, and since then, the area had become a magnet for tragedy. Disappearances, strange deaths, and whispers in the night. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I knew fear made for great stories. So, armed with my RV, a few cameras, and my journal, I set out to uncover the truth. I was used to spooky places, to creaky floors, and the paranoia of being alone. Widow's Ridge would be no different, or so I thought. I arrived just before sunset. The ridge was beautiful in a desolate way, with a rocky overlook offering sweeping views of the valley below. The wind whistled through the trees, and the skeletal oak stood alone in the clearing, its twisted branches like claws against the sky. A rope dangled from one of the limbs, frayed and swaying gently. I parked my RV in the clearing and set up camp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched long, and the ridge grew eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the hollow hum of the wind. The first unease crept in, but I brushed it off. Quiet nights in the woods were common. The first sign came that evening. I was reviewing my notes when the sound of soft crying reached my ears. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. I froze, straining to hear more. The crying stopped, replaced by a whisper so faint I couldn't make out the words. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone there?" The wind answered me. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the breeze or a distant animal call. But as I turned back toward the RV, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My journal, which I had left on the table inside, was now lying on the ground, its pages fluttering in the wind. I hadn't touched it. The next day I met Evelyn Brooks, a reclusive older woman who lived a few miles from the ridge. I had stumbled upon her cabin while hiking, hoping to gather local lore. She answered the door with a wary expression, her gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. "You shouldn't be up there," she said as soon as I mentioned Widow's Ridge. "That place is cursed." "I'm writing about the legend," I explained. "Do you know anything about Eleanor Price?" Evelyn hesitated, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't a witch, if that's what you're asking. She was a grieving mother. But grief makes people cruel, and they needed someone to blame. "Do you think her ghost is real?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Evelyn didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "If you're smart, you'll leave, and don't go near that tree. It's the anchor, her pain, her rage. It's all tied to that cursed oak." I thanked her, but I didn't leave. This was the kind of detail my readers loved. That night, the ridge turned hostile. It started with the scratches. Faint at first, like twigs scraping the side of the RV. I ignored it, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. When I stepped outside to investigate, there was nothing there, just the wind and the dark silhouette of the oak. Then came the knocking. Sharp, deliberate taps on the RV's windows. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but I was alone. My heart pounded as I locked the door and drew the curtains. At midnight, I awoke to the sound of my own voice calling from the woods. "Dana, help me." The voice was weak, trembling, and unmistakably mine. My blood turned to ice. It was as if a recording of my voice was being played back to me, distorted and wrong. I huddled in the corner of the RV, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found footprints circling the RV. Bare, human footprints that started and ended at the oak tree. They were too small for an adult, too large for a child, and they chilled me to my core. My camera, left on the table overnight, showed distorted images of the ridge, with blurry, shadowy figures in the background. I knew I should leave, but the journalist in me refused. If I could capture proof of the supernatural, it would be a career-defining moment. So, I stayed. That afternoon, I found an old locket buried near the oak. It was tarnished but intact, with a photo of a woman and 2 children inside. Eleanor Price and her children, I assumed. I tucked it into my pocket, feeling a pang of guilt I couldn't explain. That night, Eleanor made herself known. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The wind stopped entirely. The RV shook violently, as if an unseen force was slamming into it. Then, the lights inside flickered and a shadow appeared, tall and veiled, standing in the center of the room. I couldn't move. My limbs felt frozen as the figure drifted closer, its form growing more defined. I saw her face, pale, hollow, with blackened eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. "Why are you here?" she hissed, her voice like a winter wind. "You disturb my rest." "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to." The shadow lunged, and the world went dark. I woke just before dawn, slumped against the RV wall. The interior was trashed, paper scattered, windows shattered. The locket was gone, and in its place was a single word scratched into the table. Leave. But I couldn't leave, not yet. Evelyn's words echoed in my mind. The oak tree was the anchor. If I wanted to end this, I had to confront it. I stood before the tree at sunrise, holding a canister of lighter fluid and a box of matches. The rope hanging from the branch swayed unnaturally, as if moved by invisible hands. The air buzzed with energy, thick and oppressive. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," I whispered, pouring the fluid around the base of the tree. "But this has to end." The moment I struck the match, the ground trembled. Eleanor's ghost appeared, her form writhing in agony. She screamed, a sound that shook the forest, and charged at me, her veiled figure becoming a blur of shadow and fury. I lit the ring of fire just in time. The flames roared to life, encircling the oak and driving her back. She thrashed and wailed, her form dissipating into the smoke as the fire consumed the cursed tree. When it was over, the ridge was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, peaceful, almost serene. The oppressive weight had lifted. I returned to Evelyn's cabin to thank her, but the house was abandoned, covered in years of dust. On the porch was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Some stories aren't meant to be told." I left Widow's Ridge that day and never returned. To this day, I don't know if Eleanor found peace or if I simply freed her from the anchor. All I know is that some places hold darkness so deep, it's better to leave it undisturbed. My name is Daniel Harper. Most people just call me Danny. I'm 41, and I used to think I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I spent 20 years as a long-haul trucker, logging miles across empty highways and desolate landscapes. Nothing fazed me, not bad weather, not sleepless nights, not the endless stretches of silence. But what happened last fall on the Midnight Trail shook me to my core, and I'm not sure I'll ever recover. It had been 6 months since my daughter, Carly, passed away. 6 months of guilt clawing at my chest, whispering that it was my fault. I wasn't home enough. I should have seen the signs that something was wrong. If I'd been there, maybe I could have stopped her from getting in that car with her reckless boyfriend. She was only 17. It wasn't fair. But life isn't fair, is it? I couldn't sit in that empty house anymore, surrounded by her pictures, her unfinished school projects, her laughter that no longer echoed in the halls. So, I hit the road. I loaded up my RV, a beaten-up Class C I'd been fixing up, and decided to visit some of the places I used to pass by during my trucking days but never stopped to explore. Spruce, Knob, Seneca Rocks National Recreation Area was one of them. I'd heard of the Midnight Trail from a guy at a gas station. He called it beautiful but spooky, and for some reason, that stuck with me. I arrived late in the afternoon just as the sun was sinking behind the mountains. The trailhead parking lot was empty, and the forest beyond it stretched endlessly, a mix of shadows and fading light. A small memorial stood at the entrance, a wooden cross, weathered and tilted, with the name Eli Baker carved into it. Beneath it, someone had placed a handful of wilted flowers. I stared at it for a long moment. Something about it unsettled me, but I couldn't say why. Shaking off the feeling, I parked the RV, set up camp, and made myself a quick dinner. As the stars came out, the world grew eerily quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I didn't think much of it until later that night when I heard footsteps outside the RV. Soft, deliberate, circling. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, scanning the area. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and the faint outline of the trailhead. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed out there for a few minutes, my breath fogging in the cold night air, before retreating inside. That's when the radio turned on. The RV's old, static-filled radio crackled to life, playing a distorted version of Carly's favorite song. My stomach dropped. The volume was low, the lyrics warped, but I knew that song. I lunged for the dial, twisting it off. My hands were shaking. "Get a grip, Danny," I muttered to myself. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I packed a small bag and set out on the trail. The air was crisp, and the forest felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, like it was watching me. I told myself I was imagining things, that I just needed to focus on the hike. I'd always found peace in the rhythm of walking, one step after another, the weight of the world fading with every mile. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. The boot prints on the trail ahead of me looked fresh, but there was no one else out here. When I checked, they matched the soles of my boots. I tried to brush it off, but the unease was growing, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Then came the voices. At first, they were faint. A laugh here, a whispered word there. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The forest swallowed the sound. No one answered. I kept walking, faster now, my eyes scanning the trees. The voices grew louder, overlapping, fragments of conversation that made no sense. I thought I heard Carly's voice once, calling my name. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old campsite. The gear was rotting, the fabric of the tent frayed and covered in moss. A journal lay half buried in the dirt, its pages yellowed and damp. I flipped through it, reading snippets of frantic entries about getting lost, hearing voices and seeing shadows. The last entry chilled me to the bone. It won't let me leave until I face the truth. I shoved the journal back into the dirt and kept moving, my unease turning into outright fear. Not long after, I saw someone up ahead. A man, his back to me, wearing a faded flannel shirt and a backpack. Relief washed over me. "Hey," I called, jogging to catch up. "Hey, wait!" The man didn't stop. He didn't even turn around. As I got closer, I noticed something was off. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. My relief curdled into dread. "Hey!" I called again, my voice cracking. The man turned. His face was blurred like a smudged photograph, and his eyes, if he even had eyes, were dark pits. He raised a hand, pointing back the way I came, and whispered, "Turn back." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering, and when I looked up again, he was gone. The trail became a nightmare after that. No matter which direction I walked, I kept ending up in the same spots. The old campsite, a distinctive boulder with moss growing in the shape of a handprint. The trailhead itself. It was like the forest was looping, trapping me in its maze. The sunlight never changed, stuck in a perpetual golden glow that made the shadows stretch unnaturally long. My flashlight flickered despite being new, and every time I checked my watch, the time seemed wrong, jumping forward or backward by hours. I started to panic. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps, and I ran, desperate to find a way out. But the more I ran, the louder the voices grew, a cacophony of laughter, sobbing, and whispers. By the time I reached the summit, night had fallen. The trail opened onto a clearing dominated by a massive, twisted tree. Its bark was carved with dozens of names, some faded with age, others fresh and sharp. My breath caught in my throat as I saw Carly's name among them, freshly carved at the bottom. "No," I whispered, stepping closer. "No, no, no." The whispers converged, coalescing into a single figure, a girl standing beneath the tree. Carly. Her hair hung limp around her face, her clothes torn and dirty, but her eyes were empty. "Why did you leave me, Dad?" she said, her voice hollow, echoing. "You weren't there when I needed you." Tears streamed down my face. "I'm sorry," I choked. "I'm so sorry, Carly. I should have been there. I should have—" "You let me die," she said, her voice rising, her face twisting with anger. "You let me die." I fell to my knees, sobbing, the weight of my guilt crushing me. "I didn't mean to," I whispered. "I didn't mean to." The voices grew deafening, the shadows closing in around me. I felt the forest's judgment, its unrelenting demand for the truth. I had to let go. I had to forgive myself. "I'm sorry," I said, looking up at Carly's figure. "I'll never stop missing you, but I can't bring you back. I can't stay here." Her expression softened, the anger fading. She stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch me, and then she was gone. The whispers stopped, the forest fell silent, and when I looked up, the sun was rising. I made my way back to the RV, exhausted but alive. The loop was broken, and the trailhead was clear. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the tree at the summit, its twisted branches reaching skyward. Carly's name was still there, but it no longer felt like a curse. It felt like a goodbye. Sometimes I still hear her voice in my dreams, but now it's not angry, it's at peace, and maybe, just maybe, so am I. My name is Alex Moore, and I was 28 years old when I decided to abandon my city life and embrace the solitude of the wild. This happened in the spring of 2022, deep in the remote expanse of Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I had traded the chaos of my old life, a grueling tech job and a breakup that left me hollow, for the tranquility of the Appalachian wilderness. At least, that's what I thought I'd find. I had heard whispers about Black Hollow, an isolated area nestled near Cheat Mountain, but they were just that, whispers. Locals at the last gas station warned me about strange happenings in the hollow, but I chalked it up to small-town superstition. I wanted quiet, not ghost stories. My RV, modest but reliable, became my sanctuary. Equipped with solar panels and enough supplies to last a week, I parked at the edge of the hollow and planned to spend my days hiking and journaling. The first few hours were serene, just the sounds of chirping birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But by sunset, the forest had changed. The first sign was the silence. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, muting every bird, every insect. I paused mid-step on my way back to the RV, my boots crunching against the gravel road, the only sound. A chill crawled up my spine, but I shook it off. Solitude does strange things to the mind. As I prepared dinner that evening, the quiet pressed against the walls of the RV. I tried turning on my solar-powered lights, but they flickered weakly before going out entirely. A malfunction, I thought. I could fix it tomorrow. I used a flashlight instead, its narrow beam making the shadows seem alive. I was climbing into bed when I heard it, my own voice, faint and far away, calling out from the woods. "Help! Someone help me!" I froze, my heart hammering. It sounded distorted like a bad recording, but it was unmistakably me. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam toward the trees outside the window. Nothing. The voice came again, weaker this time. I thought about venturing out, but my instincts screamed at me to stay inside. I locked the door and spent a restless night listening to the silence. The next morning, I met Maya Carter, a hiker in her mid-20s with a backpack nearly her size. She'd startled me as I was adjusting my solar panels. Her bright smile clashed with the uneasy mood of the forest. "Hey there," she said. "Didn't expect to see anyone else out here. Most people avoid this place." "I'm Alex," I said, extending a hand. "What brings you to Black Hollow?" She explained that she was researching Appalachian folklore for her podcast. Her excitement was infectious, though I found her curiosity a little reckless. When I mentioned the strange silence and the voice, she brushed it off. "Classic auditory hallucination," she said. "Isolation plays tricks on you." That afternoon, we crossed paths with Chris Bennett, a park ranger who seemed to materialize out of the trees. He was gruff and weathered, his sharp eyes scanning the forest like he expected it to attack. "You shouldn't be here," he said bluntly. "Black Hollow isn't safe." "What do you mean?" Maya asked, her curiosity piqued. Chris hesitated, then sighed. "There's something wrong with this place. Call it folklore, call it whatever you want, but people disappear here. I've seen things I can't explain. Figures that shouldn't exist. If you're smart, you'll pack up and leave." I should have listened, but pride and curiosity held me back. That night, the forest came alive with terror. Maya and I had set up camp together when the first signs appeared. We found tracks, elongated footprints too large to be human but shaped like no animal I'd ever seen. They circled the RV and led off into the woods, vanishing mid-trail. Maya snapped photos, excited about the evidence, while I felt an icy weight settle in my chest. Later, as we sat by the fire, Maya gasped. "Alex," she whispered, pointing. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, me. It looked like me, down to the jacket I was wearing, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally. The firelight reflected off its eyes, 2 pinpricks of glowing yellow. It didn't move, just stared. "What the hell is that?" Maya whispered. Before I could respond, the thing vanished into the trees, its departure marked by a guttural growl that made my stomach churn. We retreated into the RV, locking the door and killing the lights. The creature prowled outside all night, scratching at the walls and whispering in our voices. By morning, Chris found us, his face grim. "It knows you're here now," he said. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Locals call it a skinwalker," Chris said. "It's tied to this land, ancient and vengeful. It thrives on fear, on driving people mad. You can't kill it, but you might be able to keep it at bay." His plan involved fire. We would build a ring of flames around the RV and hold our ground until dawn. "But it won't like that," Chris warned. "It'll fight back." That night, the forest seemed to breathe, the wind carrying voices and the sound of snapping branches. As we lit the fire, the skinwalker revealed its full horror. It no longer bothered with disguises. It stalked the edge of the flames as a grotesque hybrid of man and beast, its face twisted into a permanent snarl. It growled, low and menacing, before lunging at the barrier, only to recoil with a shriek. It didn't stop. It circled the fire endlessly, its form shifting from human to animal to something unrecognizable. The sight was maddening, and I fought to keep my focus. Then it changed tactics. "Alex," it called in Maya's voice. "It's me. I'm hurt. Please help." I looked at her, huddled beside Chris, pale and shaking. "Don't listen," she whispered. Chris suddenly stood, his face blank. "It's calling me," he muttered. "Chris, no!" I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off and stepped into the dark. The skinwalker pounced, its claws tearing into him as he screamed. Maya and I watched in horror, unable to do anything. By dawn, the forest was silent again, and the creature was gone. We stumbled back to the edge of the hollow, Chris's sacrifice heavy on our shoulders. His warning stayed with me. Some places aren't meant for us. I abandoned my RV and left Black Hollow, vowing never to return. Maya quit her podcast, too haunted to revisit the stories she once sought. To this day, I hear that growl in my nightmares, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. If you ever find yourself in Black Hollow, heed this warning. Turn back. Some legends are real, and they hunger. My name is Jack Travis. I'm 34, and last fall, I found myself stranded in the heart of Canaan Mountain backcountry, West Virginia, battling something I still can't fully explain. I'm a mechanic by trade, a pragmatist by nature, and I've always believed there's a rational explanation for everything. That belief was shattered on the coldest night of my life. This trip was supposed to be my victory lap. I'd spent over a year restoring a beat-up 1978 Winnebago RV, and when I turned the key and heard the engine roar to life for the first time, it felt like conquering a mountain. The Canaan Mountain wilderness seemed like the perfect place to test it. Isolated, rugged, and breathtaking, the backcountry offered me a chance to be alone with my thoughts and proved the RV could handle the toughest terrain. The first 2 hours of the drive were smooth. The roads narrowed as I climbed higher, with the dense forest pressing in from both sides. The GPS lost its signal halfway up, but I had my trusty map and compass. I wasn't worried. By late afternoon, I'd found a clearing off a dirt road where I could park the RV and set up camp. The air was crisp, the light golden as it filtered through the trees. It felt perfect. I spent the evening cooking dinner over a campfire, enjoying the solitude. The world felt far away, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. By the time I climbed into the RV to sleep, the fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was silent. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, a stillness so complete it feels unnatural. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't the wind, nor the creak of the RV settling. It was softer. Whispers, low and indistinct, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. My first thought was animals, maybe raccoons or coyotes. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, too still. No insects, no rustling leaves, just the faintest echo of those whispers, slipping through the air like smoke. I shook my head, muttered something about overactive imaginations, and went back inside. But I couldn't sleep. The morning broke cold and gray, with a thick mist curling through the trees. I shrugged off the night's unease and decided to explore. I laced up my boots, grabbed my compass, and headed into the forest, following a faint trail that wound deeper into the wilderness. About an hour in, I stumbled across something strange. An old, crumbling stone cabin hidden beneath a canopy of gnarled trees. The roof had long since collapsed, and moss clung to the walls. Inside, I found a rusted metal kettle, shattered glass bottles, and a small leather journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but I could still make out fragments of the writing. It belonged to a man named Amos in the 1800s, and the entries detailed his encounters with what he called the Witch of Canaan Mountain. Amos claimed the witch was a reclusive woman accused of witchcraft by settlers who later killed her. Before her death, she cursed the mountain, vowing that anyone who disrespected it would suffer her wrath. I laughed to myself. Classic Appalachian folklore. People loved their ghost stories. but I couldn't shake a lingering unease as I left the cabin and made my way back to the RV. By the time I returned, the mist had thickened, and the RV looked eerie in the fading light. I climbed inside, feeling a strange chill that wasn't just from the weather. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. My compass was spinning wildly, the needle refusing to settle. I sat at the table, trying to calm my nerves, when I heard it again. The whispers. This time they were louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all directions surrounding the RV. My flashlight flickered as I stepped outside. I scanned the clearing, my breath fogging in the cold air, but there was no one there. Then I saw it. A pile of stones, neatly stacked in a triangle, sitting a few feet from the RV. I hadn't put it there, and I was certain it wasn't there before. My stomach tightened, but I told myself someone was probably messing with me. A prank, or some local superstition. I kicked the pile over and went back inside, locking the door behind me. That was a mistake. That night, everything went wrong. It started with the RV. The heater cut out first, then the lights flickered and died. When I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't even turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel line, everything I could think of. But there was no logical explanation. It was as if the RV itself had been drained of life. As I worked, the whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't just outside anymore. They were inside, echoing in the walls, the floor, the cabinets. My tools began to move. I'd set a wrench down, only to find it on the other side of the RV seconds later. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment I saw a shadow move across the window. I froze. It wasn't human. I couldn't stay inside. The RV felt suffocating, alive with unseen malice. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the night, determined to find the source of the whispers. The forest was alive with movement, shadows flitting between the trees, just beyond the edge of the light. I found myself drawn back to the stone cabin, as if some unseen force was guiding me. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of overlapping voices. When I reached the clearing, the hunched figure of a woman stood in the doorway of the cabin. She wasn't human. Her skin was pale and stretched taut, her eyes hollow voids that seemed to pull the light from the air. Her voice, if it could even be called that, was a low, rasping hiss. "You have trespassed," she said, though her mouth didn't move. The words echoed in my mind. "You have disrespected this place." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground. She raised a skeletal hand, and the whispers surged, each voice filled with anger and pain. I saw flashes, images of settlers, the burning cabin, the witch's death. I felt her rage, her sorrow, her unrelenting need for vengeance. She offered me a choice: leave behind something of great value to appease her, or be trapped on the mountain forever. My heart pounded as I realized what she meant. My RV, my pride and joy, the project I'd poured everything into for over a year. She wanted me to destroy it. I tried to reason with her, to beg, but her form began to dissolve, the shadows closing in. I ran back to the RV, the whispers and shadows following me. I grabbed a can of fuel and a lighter, tears streaming down my face as I doused the RV in gasoline. When I struck the match, it felt like I was burning a part of myself. The fire roared, lighting up the clearing. The whispers faded, the shadows retreating as the flames consumed the RV. For the first time in hours, the forest was silent. By morning, the fire had burned itself out, leaving only the charred remains of my RV. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence gone. I gathered what little I could carry and followed the trail back to civilization. This time, the path was clear. I've told this story to a few people since then, but no one believes me. They chalk it up to isolation, exhaustion, or my own imagination. But I know what I saw, what I heard. I left a part of myself on Canaan Mountain that night, and I'm not sure I'll ever get it back. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the whispers. My name is Kate Summers. I'm 28 years old, and this happened in the fall of last year. I thought I was heading into the wilderness for a peaceful escape with my best friend Elise and her co-worker, Derek. Instead, I walked straight into a nightmare I'll never forget. It started with a simple plan. I'd heard about the beauty of Red Creek Hollow, tucked away in Dolly Sods, West Virginia. Rugged, isolated, breathtakingly wild. It was everything I needed to reset after months of grinding at work. Elise was going through a rough breakup, and I thought the trip would be good for her too. She was hesitant, but finally agreed, as long as she could bring Derek, a co-worker I barely knew but figured couldn't be worse than the third wheeling my best friend. We rented a small RV, packed with enough food, gear, and optimism to last 3 days. By the time we arrived at Red Creek Hollow, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the dense trees. Derek, in his ever-present ball cap, immediately pulled out his camera, excited to document every second of the trip for his YouTube channel. Elise rolled her eyes, muttering something about wannabe influencers, but I brushed it off. I wasn't going to let their tension ruin the trip. We parked the RV near a trailhead, surrounded by towering trees and the distant sound of rushing water. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't realize you miss until you're far from the hum of the city. As we settled in, Derek was still fiddling with his camera, muttering about perfect lighting. Elise cracked open a beer, already annoyed by him. The first sign that something wasn't right came that night. I woke up to a faint sound outside the RV, whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't random. The voices rose and fell like a conversation, just out of earshot. I shook it off, convincing myself it was my imagination. But when I mentioned it the next morning, Elise frowned. "You heard it too?" she asked, her voice unusually serious. "I thought it was you guys screwing with me." Derek, ever the skeptic, laughed. "It's probably just the wind. Relax. This place is ancient. Sounds carry weird in the woods." The plan for day 2 was simple. Hike deeper into the hollow, explore some of the less traveled trails, and film as much of the stunning landscape as we could. Derek insisted on using an old map he'd found online instead of relying on GPS. I didn't love the idea, but he was confident, and Elise seemed indifferent. The hike started fine, but it didn't take long for things to feel off. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots and the occasional snap of Derek's camera. Then we found the clearing. It was small, littered with rusted tools, a broken saw, a mangled rake, and a child's shoe half buried in the dirt. The air felt heavier there, like we'd walked into a space that didn't want us. Derek, of course, was thrilled. He crouched by the shoe, angling his camera for the best shot. "Creepy, right?" he said. "This'll get so many views." "Let's keep moving," Elise said sharply. She wasn't one to spook easily, but her voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. We left the clearing, but the unease followed us. That night, things escalated. Derek decided to step outside the RV to film the stars. He was out there for maybe 20 minutes when I heard him call out, "Elise, hey, come check this out." I glanced at Elise, who was sitting across from me, flipping through a paperback. "What does he want now?" she muttered, not bothering to move. Then her voice came from outside the RV. "Coming!" Elise froze. "What the hell?" The blood drained from my face as I realized what I'd heard. It wasn't her voice exactly. It was too soft, too stretched, but it was close enough to be unnerving. Derek must have heard it too because he came barreling back inside, pale as a ghost. "You're screwing with me, right?" he said, his voice shaking. "You were out there." "I've been in here the whole time," Elise snapped, her irritation masking her fear. None of us slept that night. The next morning, we agreed to pack up and leave, but the RV wouldn't start. Derek tried everything, checking the battery, the fuel line, but it was like the engine had just died. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the trail and making it impossible to navigate. We decided to hike out, leaving the RV behind. Derek brought his camera, of course, though he was unusually quiet. Elise stayed close to me, her usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. That's when we started seeing the shadows. At first, they were just flickers in the corner of my eye, but soon they became more defined, humanoid shapes darting between the trees, too fast and too quiet to be human. Derek tried filming them, but his camera kept glitching, the screen filling with static whenever he pointed it toward the woods. Then the voices came back. They weren't whispers anymore. They were loud, overlapping, almost frantic. They called our names, begged for help, laughed. Elise broke first, covering her ears and yelling for them to stop. Derek spun in circles, his camera forgotten, shouting into the fog. "Show yourselves!" he screamed. "You want to scare us? Do it." That's when it appeared. It stepped out of the fog like it had been waiting for the invitation. Tall, impossibly thin, its body seemed to absorb the light around it. Its face, or lack of one, was a black void, but its presence was suffocating. We froze. Derek, in a panic, picked up a rock and hurled it at the figure. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it turned toward him, tilting its head as if studying him. Then it spoke, in Elise's voice. "Help me, Derek, I'm scared." Derek lost it. He ran into the fog, chasing the voice. I screamed for him to stop, but he was already gone. His cries echoed for a moment before fading into silence. Elise and I were alone now. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "What do we do, Kate? What do we do?" I remembered the legend I'd read before the trip, about the entity the locals called the Hollow Man. It thrived on fear and confusion, luring travelers to their doom. The only way to survive was to confront it without fear, a tall order, considering I was terrified out of my mind. "We have to face it," I said, though my voice wavered. "If we run, we're dead." Elise looked at me like I was insane, but nodded. We turned back toward the fog, where the figure still lingered, its head cocked like it was amused. It stepped closer, its shadow stretching impossibly far. The voices grew louder, echoing our worst fears. It mimicked Derek's voice, begging for help. Then it spoke in my mother's voice, asking why I'd left her alone before she died. Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to take a step forward. "You don't scare me," I lied, my voice trembling. It paused as if considering my words. The shadows seemed to shrink, the voices dimming. Elise joined me, her hand gripping mine tightly. "You're not real," she said, her voice steadier than mine. The Hollow Man tilted its head again before dissolving into the fog, leaving us in an eerie silence. We found our way back to the RV hours later, exhausted and shaken. Miraculously, it started without issue. We drove out of Red Creek Hollow in silence, the weight of what we'd experienced too heavy to put into words. Derek was never found. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but there was no trace of him. Just his camera, discovered by a hiker months later. The last frame showed a shadowy figure standing behind him, its faceless head tilted in that same unnerving way. Even now, I hear whispers sometimes, in the wind, in my dreams. I tell myself it's nothing, but deep down, I know the truth. The Hollow Man isn't done with me, and one day, he'll come back. 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 He'll come back.